I am the heir to the Wong Group. In order to marry my first love, the wedding was arranged in the most extravagant and grand manner. All the influential figures in the city were invited. However, no one expected that during the wedding procession, my future mother-in-law suddenly demanded an additional $3 million as a dowry to pay off my brother-in-law's gambling debts, just as everyone thought I would give in to save face. The next moment I turned around and handed the bouquet in my hand to the bridesmaid behind me. I asked Willow, "Will you marry me?" Under the surprised gaze of my mother-in-law, fiancé, and brother-in-law, she smiled, took the bouquet, and said, "I will." Chapter 1. My future mother-in-law, with a smile on her face, blocked the wedding room door and said, "George, your family can afford this $3 million. We just want to see your attitude." My brother-in-law crossed his arms, the layers of fat on his neck shaking as he spoke. "Brother-in-law, hurry up and pay. The people over there are already demanding their money." My mother-in-law quickly slapped him and gave him a look to silence him. I could already guess my brother-in-law had probably gambled again last night and lost a lot. Taking a deep breath and remembering how my fiancé had teary eyes and begged me to help her escape this family, I finally calmed down. My fiancée is a fragile yet strong girl. I met her at a dinner party where a fat man had shoved a stack of red bills at her, asking her to stay and drink with him. My fiancée bit her lip, her eyes red, shaking her head stubbornly, saying that no matter how desperate she was for money, she would never do such a thing. The men, enraged, threw the money at her face, and the sharp paper cut her cheek. I stepped in. People knew I was from the Panda Group, so they gave me some respect. My fiancé blushed and thanked me. Grateful. I felt sorry for her. In today's world, it's rare to find someone who remains pure and doesn't bow down to money, especially when I later learned she came from a family that valued sons over daughters. I wanted to rescue her from this hellish situation. I calmed myself and spoke to my mother-in-law in a gentle tone. "Mrs. Liu, this wedding has already cost a lot, and there's an $880,000 dowry. Our family's finances are tight right now, and it's really hard to come up with an extra $3 million at once. How about we get married first, and then we can discuss the rest later?" My brother-in-law suddenly cursed. "Go to hell. After marrying my sister, where are we supposed to get the money?" I frowned. My mother-in-law quickly stopped him, forcing a dry laugh. "I always said the wedding shouldn't be too extravagant. Look at this. What we spent on the wedding could have been given directly to us. My family runs a leading company in the city, and I'm the only child. How could the wedding be done carelessly? Moreover, the money spent on the wedding was not going to be handed over to them without reason," I said. "Can you open the door first? I want to know what Maria thinks." Maria definitely wouldn't want me to pay such a sky-high dowry. My mother-in-law pursed her lips and said that she, as Maria's mother, could take full responsibility for the wedding. But only after I paid the $3 million would she open the door. The groomsmen behind me were silent. David, one of the groomsmen, nudged me and whispered in my ear to open the door. "It's $3 million later. There will also be wedding shoes and red envelope for addressing parents. Who knows how much more they'll ask for. What are you going to do, brother? If you can't gather the money, I can borrow some for my dad for you." I shook my head and glanced at the bedroom door lock, which could be opened from the inside. I immediately called out, "Maria, I'm outside. If you're willing to marry me, please open the door." Hearing me calling his sister, my brother-in-law panicked and charged at us like a big meatball. The groomsmen and my brother-in-law jostled with each other. Click. The door opened, but the person behind the door wasn't Maria. Chapter 2. My friend and bridesmaid stuck her head out with a grin and said, "I've been a cop my whole life, but this is the first time I've gone undercover. George, hurry up and get in. They won't let me open the door, but I've done you a huge favor." The groomsmen and I rushed in, but my mother-in-law, standing off to the side, looked displeased as she watched the bridesmaid open the door. The bridesmaid was my childhood friend, Willow. My fiancé's family had such poor relations that they couldn't even find enough bridesmaids as the wedding day approached. So I had no choice but to let my childhood friend, who was on break, step in. I rushed into the room and asked Maria if she wanted to leave with me. If she did, she could escape her family's patriarchal grip. Maria's eyes darted away, and after a moment of silence, she said, "Have you gathered the 3 million?" Her words hit me like a bucket of cold water, drenching me from head to toe. My mother-in-law also pushed her way in, casting a displeased glance at Willow for opening the door, and then, smugly, she looked at me and said, "My daughter always listens to me. If you want to marry her, call your parents and get the other 3 million, or you'll miss the lucky hour." Willow, hearing my mother-in-law's words, was stunned. She couldn't help but speak up. 3 million for a dowry? That's a sky-high dowry. David immediately stopped Willow, signaling her to stay quiet. Willow, clearly upset, stood behind me. The room fell silent, everyone waiting for my reaction. I looked at my fiancé's face and asked her, "Is this what you think, too? If I can't come up with the money, you won't marry me." Maria's eyes reddened again, and she said, "I want to marry you. But, George, my brother lost 3 million last night without this money. They'll cut off his hands. I'm sorry, but he's my brother, and I can't just ignore him." I stared at her coldly and said, "If you were already married to me and your brother lost a few more million, would you still expect me to pay off his debts?" Before Maria could answer, my brother-in-law jumped in. "Of course, she'll always be my sister. You think marrying her means she's sold to your family? Of course she'll take care of me." My fiancé frowned, but didn't argue. I realized then that she had been deceiving me all along. She promised me that if I married her, I would be rescuing her from a family that valued sons over daughters, and she would sever ties with them and never pay her gambling brother's debts again. The truth was, she wouldn't stop paying her brother's debts, she would just shift the burden onto me. My parents called, asking where I was since the lucky time was fast approaching. Hearing my parents call, my mother-in-law looked pleased, glanced at the time and smiled. "George, I'm not being unreasonable. The lucky time is almost here. Don't miss it. How about this? You can just write a promissory note for the extra 3 million. My fiancé looked at me with hopeful eyes and said, "Darling, if you write the promissory note, we can get married." Willow, furious, was about to say something but was quickly pushed back by David. I heard David whisper from behind me, "Don't cause trouble, ancestor." Willow muttered under her breath, calling David a jerk, saying George was being bullied and David wasn't helping. I turned to see Willow's eyes red with frustration. Chapter 3. I picked up the bouquet, turned around, and knelt down on one knee. "Willow, will you marry me?" Willow froze. I winked at her, and she immediately understood. Willow pretended to be overjoyed, looking at me with exaggerated starry eyes, and said, "I will." My groomsmen cheered in unison, playing along with us. My mother-in-law was the first to snap back to reality. She rushed over to grab my arm, smiling obsequiously, and said, "George, I was just kidding. You don't need to add the dowry." Maria, stumbling in her heavy wedding gown, barefoot, ran to my side with tears in her eyes. She looked at me and said, "George, are you going to leave me?" Every time I saw her looking so pitiful, I used to soften. I would feel sympathy for her, but this time I only felt disgusted. I pushed her hand away and said, "I gave you a chance. You asked me to save you. I'm sorry, but your family is a swamp. I can't save you. Don't contact me again." After saying that, I grabbed Willow's hand and turned to leave. My brother-in-law, blocking the door, stood like a solid wall in front of us. He shouted, "My sister is your woman. You have to take responsibility." I coldly looked at him and said I never touched your sister. She's not mine anymore. I broke up with her. I had always cared for Maria until marriage. I was determined not to touch her. My brother-in-law started throwing a tantrum, blocking the door and refusing to let us out. He yelled, "Well, if you broke up with my sister, you still have to pay for the breakup compensation." "What? She's been with you all this time for free. You can't just say you didn't touch her." "Pay up," Willow, tying up her hair, said. "Let me handle this. I've never liked this guy." David and I quietly covered our eyes. Willow was the champion of all brawls. After several screams, David and I opened our eyes. My brother-in-law was now lying on the floor. My mother-in-law screamed and threw herself onto my brother-in-law, cursing us with the foulest words. Maria, furious and humiliated, shouted behind me, "George, you're not a man. You're so unreliable. You promised to marry me, and now you're turning your back over something as small as a dowry. George, you're such a jerk. A total jerk." I couldn't be bothered to listen to her anymore. Her words and actions left me cold. I stepped over my brother-in-law and into the wedding car with my groomsmen. On the way to the car, I felt utterly exhausted. Maria was my first love. I had truly loved her. I even fought with my parents for a long time, and only after they finally agreed did we proceed with this wedding. David, driving, noticed I had my eyes shut and was silent for a long time. Unable to resist, he asked, "George, what about the wedding?" He almost made me forget. I quickly called my parents. My mom answered. "Hey, son, where are you?" "Hurry up and come here," I replied. "Mom, cancel the wedding." "I'm sorry. I should have listened to you from the start." My parents were silent for a few seconds. They must have guessed what happened and comforted me. They said it was better to cancel the wedding than to regret it later. They told me this wedding could just be a meal with family and friends. After hanging up, Maria bombarded me with calls and messages, saying she regretted everything. Her mom and brother had pressured her, and if she didn't go along with them, they wouldn't let her be with me. She kept begging me to come back and pick her up. I sent her a message. "It's over." Maria flooded my phone with messages. She wrote, "You promised to protect me forever. You said you'd be my hero. You said I was your precious rose. Are you really going to give up on our love, George? Don't you love me anymore?" I smiled bitterly when I read her messages, then turned off my phone. Chapter 4. I sat in my office, lost in thought, reflecting on how I had ended up in this mess over the years, where I had alienated everyone just to marry Maria. Yesterday's wedding banquet had turned into a joke, and some of my friends and family had advised me to just endure it for now, to avoid embarrassment. But I feared that the longer I stayed, the more trouble would come. Her family would likely bring countless issues in the future. Suddenly, a commotion broke my thoughts as Maria and her secretary barged into the office, shoving each other. The secretary quickly apologized. "Sorry, Chairman Wong, I couldn't stop Miss Maria." I waved my hand, signaling for the secretary to leave. Leaning back in my chair, I asked Maria what she wanted. Maria pouted, looking wronged, with tears in her eyes as she crouched in front of me and coquettishly said, "I'm sorry. Yesterday, it was all my mom's fault. She said if I didn't do what she told me, she wouldn't let us get married. Honey, I still love you. Honey, don't be angry. Please forgive me." "I only felt disgusted," I said. "Stop calling me honey. We've broken up. From now on, you go your way and I'll go mine." She trembled and said, "George, I know you're angry. You're mad because I played along with Willow yesterday. I know you're not with her. How could you like such a fierce woman? She even hits people." I sighed and replied, "Yes, I'm not with Willow, but what right do you have to talk about her?" Maria's face turned pale and red in turns, and she asked, "George, do you still love me?" This question again. All these years with Maria, whenever I didn't do things exactly as she wanted, she would start asking, "Do you still love me?" I was so fed up with it. I poked her shoulder and shouted, "Whether I love you or not, you should ask yourself. I've fought with my parents for years just to marry you. You wanted a dowry of $880,000. Fine. My parents didn't want to pay, so I went out and earned it myself. How many nights did I stay up late working? You don't know. How many drinks did I have to endure with others? You don't know. I worked through several all-nighters, almost dying from exhaustion. My parents only gave in because they were worried about me. They agreed to the dowry, to the villa, everything. But you and your mom and brother just casually ask for another $3 million. Sure, my family can afford it, but that doesn't mean we're made of money. You can't just take advantage of me because I like you." My emotions were running high, and as I said this, I couldn't help but feel my eyes redden. Maria still looked at me with a pitiful, pouty face. She was always like this, never seeing her own problems, always placing herself as the victim in her mind. I was supposed to always accommodate her. Her reaction suddenly made me realize Maria and her family would never change. I took a deep breath to calm myself and said coldly, "All right, I have nothing more to say to you. From now on, let's stay out of each other's lives. Never show up in front of me again. Please leave." Maria refused to leave. She suddenly knelt in front of me, choking on her words. "George, for the sake of all these years, I'm not asking you to marry me again, but can you lend me $3 million? If I don't get it, my brother really will have his hand chopped off. Give me the $3 million and I'll do anything you want." As she said this, she started to undress, revealing her white shoulders. I stared at her, dumbfounded, feeling like a stranger to her. She seemed nothing like the fragile yet strong girl I had once known. Over the years, I had pitied her and to take responsibility for her. I had been patient, even resisting the final step with her. I would rather suffer myself than push her. And now she was casually undressing herself. "Get out," I said, picking up the phone. "Secretary, come in. There are cameras in the office if you're thinking about accusing me of something." "Forget it," I said as I lit a cigarette and stood by the window, staring at the traffic below. Maria, feeling wronged, got up and dressed herself. I asked, "Are you leaving on your own, or should I have someone throw you out?"
She said,
"George, can we go back to the way things were?" I replied.
"No."
I took a deep drag of the cigarette, the smoke filling my lungs before it slowly drifted up. The secretary knocked outside the door. "Chairman Wong, may I come in?" Maria, trying to save face in front of others, quickly fixed her clothes, grabbed her bag, opened the door, and walked out. Chapter 5. As soon as I finished work and arrived at the parking lot, I saw Maria's mother standing next to my car with an arrogant expression. She spoke up. "George, you have an attitude problem. If you really wanted to marry Maria, you should have come begging me long ago. If you could just beg us a little, we might consider forgiving you." I ignored her. Opening the car door, she snorted coldly, saying, "If you're going to keep up this attitude, then I'll start arranging blind dates for Maria. Don't regret it." I couldn't understand why her family was so confident about everything. Why did they think I would continue chasing after them like some dog forever? I didn't want to say a word to her. I just got into the car and slammed the accelerator, driving off. Maria's mother stumbled back as the car zoomed away. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw her brother emerge from some corner. The two of them were looking at the back of my car, seemingly discussing something. I quickly tapped on my phone and found the property manager's number. I asked, "Can anyone just walk into the parking lot now? Handle this. From now on, neither my ex-girlfriend nor her family is allowed anywhere near our company." "Understood, Chairman Wong." The next day, on my way to the office, Maria's mother suddenly dashed out from somewhere and threw herself in front of my car. Fortunately, my car had an automatic obstacle avoidance function, and with an emergency brake, I barely missed her. I got out of the car in a fury, shouting, "Are you trying to die? Are you planning to sacrifice your life to pay off your son's gambling debts? Are you trying to frame me?" Maria's family had constantly lowered their status in my eyes, and I couldn't help but think the worst of them. Her mother's attitude was completely different from yesterday. She was holding a lunchbox and smiling obsequiously. "Son-in-law, you're overthinking things. Yesterday, I saw that you looked a little worn out, so I made some chicken soup for you.
Try it.
It's still hot." Looking at her forced smile, with crow's feet and a double chin, I felt disgusted when people offer too much kindness for no reason. It's either deceit or manipulation. Gritting my teeth, I said, "Get away from my car. If you bother me again, I'll call the police." She stubbornly lay across the hood of my car, preventing me from driving off. She said, "George, I'm begging you. Please give Maria another chance. She's been crying at home all day. Maria really does love you. Where was this concern before? When I went to pick her up for the wedding, she didn't have this attitude." I stepped on the reverse gear and hit the gas pedal. She grabbed the lunchbox and chased after my car. I drove around her, and as soon as I got back to the office, the first thing I did was switch cars to avoid any further harassment from Maria's family. Chapter 6. After I kicked Maria out of my office that day, I didn't hear from her again. David suddenly contacted me, looking all mysterious, claiming he had a huge secret to share with me. George, this is a really big secret. Do you want to hear it? For just 998 yuan, I'll tell you everything. I wasn't in the mood and couldn't stand David's annoying attitude, so I said, no need. Keep your secret to yourself. David, unable to get what he wanted, paused awkwardly. I knew exactly how he worked. Sure enough, David grabbed my arm and said, forget 998, how about 98? I rolled my eyes and said, no need, just let it remain a secret forever. Seeing I was about to leave, David hurriedly grabbed me and gritted his teeth. Don't go, I'll tell you, your little brother, because he couldn't pay back the money, had one of his fingers chopped off, I asked. That's it, he replied. Isn't that enough to vent your anger? He made things difficult for us during the wedding procession. I sneered, about to walk away when David grabbed me again and said, come on, I'll take you somewhere. Without waiting for me to respond, David dragged me to a dinner party. I asked, what am I doing here? Just as I spoke, I saw Maria again. She was standing next to that fat man who had harassed her when we first met, with his arm around her slim waist. I felt a bit confused, but didn't show it. After all, there was no longer anything between us. When Maria saw me, her face momentarily showed panic. Then she pretended not to recognize me. During the dinner, the fat man kept pushing Maria to drink for him. At first, she obediently drank, but as time passed, she couldn't handle the alcohol, and I saw her throw me a pleading look. I ignored it when I helped her before. It was because I saw her couldn't resist the harassment, but now she was voluntarily at this dinner as an accessory. The fat man started touching Maria's thigh and gave it a hard slap, laughing as he looked at me and said, bro, I remember you back then. You were arguing with me over Maria. He took a puff of his cigar and said leisurely, I know you're the heir to the Panda Group, so I didn't take it too seriously, but your taste is awful. He seemed to remember something and burst into laughter, saying a woman like her. Just throw a bit of money and she'll go with you. You still wanted to marry her. Everyone in our little circle has had her, and you still want to take the plunge. You're still young. His words made the atmosphere around the table awkward. Maria looked like she was enduring something and wanted to refute him, but didn't dare speak out. Giving me another pleading look, I gave David a glance and he immediately understood, acting like he was familiar with the fat man, putting an arm around him, saying that he had drunk too much and was talking nonsense. I got up to go to the restroom. After all, Maria had once been the woman I loved, someone I treated as precious. Yet now she was being humiliated like this. I looked at myself in the mirror, not sure whether I was the foolish one or if Maria was the tragic one. Maria suddenly appeared behind me, her eyes brimming with tears, saying, George, I'm not like he said. I just need the money. I had no choice, I replied. It's none of my business. I washed my hands and was about to walk past her. Maria grabbed my sleeve, gritting her teeth and saying, George, how can you be so heartless? If you had just let me 3 million, would I have ended up like this? Would my brother have lost a finger? I frowned and said I didn't make your brother gamble, nor did I make you come here to drink. I forcefully yanked my arm away from her and continued. Why are you blaming me for the things you and your family have done wrong? I didn't go after your family, but don't think I couldn't have. I could crush you and your family easily. I'm not dealing with you out of respect for the past, so get lost. Don't make me do something I'll regret. Hearing my words, Maria's tears started flowing again, and she bit her lip tightly. I said, actually, the easiest way to solve everything is for you to cut ties with your family. Once you do that, all your problems will be solved. Your brother is just a bottomless pit. Out of kindness, I gave her a last piece of advice. Considering we had once been together, Maria cried. But he's still my little brother. She was hopeless, willingly becoming the source of support for a gambling addict brother. I pushed her aside and walked out of the hotel, sending David a message. I'm heading back late at night. As I was about to fall asleep, David called me. He hesitated, rambling on, and I was so tired I almost hung up. It wasn't until he finally said, Bro, I have to tell you something. Brace yourself, I replied. Go ahead, he sighed and said. You might have been tricked. I went and asked around in that fat guy's circle. You know, those nouveau riche, greasy uncles who play around. Maria has always been good at pretending to be a little innocent flower, specifically targeting those kinds of men. She accidentally snagged you. Hearing me stay silent, he quickly added. But it's okay, bro. You cut your losses in time. Just think of it like stepping in dog poop, I said. It's fine. It's already over, he replied. Good. Just don't cry under the covers alone at night. After a few jokes, I hung up the phone and silently pulled the blanket over my head. I felt dirty, so dirty. At least I never touched her. Chapter 7. The fat man who had once harassed Maria suddenly contacted me. Our two companies were about to collaborate on a project, and he told me that men should focus on their careers and not let Maria get in the way of our cooperation. He offered this dinner as an apology. After several attempts to set up a meeting, I reluctantly agreed to have dinner with him. The fat man was surrounded by a group of women. He took a sip of tea, swirled it around in his mouth, then turned and spit it into one of the women's wine glass. He casually waved me to choose one of them and slapped a woman in a white bodycon dress on the back, saying go and serve Chairman Wong. I quickly waved my hands in embarrassment and said, let's talk business. Can you have them leave first? The fat man laughed heartily. I didn't expect Chairman Wong to be so innocent. He poured me a drink, but I declined, he said. Chairman Wong, if you don't drink, it means you haven't forgiven me. Here's the deal. You drink this glass, and I'll give you a bit more of the project. I raised my glass to him and drank it in front of him, turning the glass upside down to show I had finished it. The fat man looked at me with a gradually malicious smile. I realized the drink was tampered with as I collapsed in my seat. He whispered in my ear with a sinister laugh, daring to take the project from me. You're out of your depth. This project is already mine. Then he yelled out, Come in. We're done here. Click, clack. The sound of high heels grew closer. He said, Let's go. The room's ready. Stick to the plan and hurry up. Be careful. His people might catch on. Two of them stumbled as they dragged me upstairs to the hotel room. The fat man said, Hurry up and strip. Then I heard Maria's voice. Can you leave first? The fat man responded, What are you pretending for? What haven't I seen? Maria stopped talking, and only the sound of clothes rustling filled the room. The fat man muttered a few filthy words from the side. I opened my eyes, shouted angrily, What the hell are you doing? The fat man smiled wickedly, raised his phone, and said, What am I doing? The great George, chairman of Panda Group, forcing a good woman. Do you know what kind of damage this would do to your company if these photos get out? I asked. You went through all this trouble to set me up.
Just tell me what you want, he said.
It's simple. Give us $5 million and you step out of the project. I'll take it all. Maria, naked, hid behind the fat man, too scared to look at me, I said. You're extorting me, he laughed. Chairman Wong, don't make it sound so ugly. We're just doing business here, I asked. Aren't you afraid I'll report this to the police? The fat man shrugged indifferently, took out my phone and played with it in his hand, saying the phone's in my possession. How are you going to call the police once this is done? Do you have any evidence? I scoffed and clapped my hands. David, who had been lurking outside, kicked open the door with a few of his men. Maria frantically grabbed the clothes on the floor and covered herself up. I pointed to the hidden button camera on my shirt and said, You think I'd trust you that much? No preparation. You think I'd come to dinner unprepared? The fat man and Maria looked shocked as they saw the camera. You didn't drink that glass, the fat man stammered. I said, We're all old foxes at the drinking table. Swapping drinks and pouring wine isn't that hard for me. Now, what's it going to be? Public or private? The fat man cursed under his breath, realizing he was done for. He said, I've spent my whole life playing with eagles. Didn't expect to be pecked in the eye by one. I'm out of the project. I nodded, signaling him to leave. Without a word, the fat man dropped Maria and quickly ran off. Once the fat man was gone, Maria, seeing that no one was supporting her, knelt in front of me. She said, George, I'm sorry. I rubbed my temples and said, "Don't say anything useless. I warned you last time. I don't want to deal with your family. I don't want to see you again. Just tell me your brother's legs or arms. Choose one." Maria's eyes widened in shock, tears and snot flowing as she sobbed. "No, he's my brother. George, please, for the sake of all the years we spent together, let me go this time." I nodded to David and his men, signaling them to listen carefully. I said, "Okay, here's your last chance." Maria was overwhelmed with gratitude, crawling out of the room. In reality, I was just scaring her. I would never engage in criminal activities. Chapter 8. As time gradually returned to normal, my family began pressuring me about marriage and introduced me to potential matches. Finally, it was the weekend, and I didn't want to go home. I dragged David out to have tea with me. David looked at the floating tea leaves in his cup and said, "Big brother, you called me out, but you haven't said a word. We can't just sit here doing nothing, right? A friend of mine just opened a private club. Do you want to go check it out?" I thought about it for a moment. It could help pass the time. So I agreed. Just as we were about to head out, my phone suddenly rang. I answered the call. It was that family causing trouble again. The police asked me to come help them rescue a hostage. My former brother-in-law, Marco, had been pushed to his limits by loan sharks and was now holding a knife to his sister Maria's neck, threatening the police to give him $5 million. The police refused, and Marco then threatened to kill Maria unless I came to speak with him. I couldn't help but laugh bitterly. Maria's life or death wasn't my concern. They were just a bunch of sibling quarrels. So I said, "Sorry, I have no relation to his family. Can I refuse to go?" The police seemed a bit hesitant, but insisted that I should come. They said Marco was emotionally unstable and might do something irrational to the hostage. Reluctantly, I agreed to cooperate with them and headed to my ex-mother-in-law's house. The area was completely sealed off and the police wouldn't let me inside for my safety. They only allowed me to stay outside the window and communicate with Marco. Marco was agitated. The kitchen knife pressed firmly against Maria's neck, leaving several bloody streaks on her skin. Maria's face was filled with terror. My ex-mother-in-law stood next to me, crying and shouting for her son to calm down while also demanding the police gather money to save her daughter. Marco stood in the corner, just out of view of the window outside. Snipers had already taken their positions, and a middle-aged police officer was trying to persuade Marco not to do anything rash. Maria, her face streaked with tears and snot, was standing in a puddle of yellow liquid. She saw me and got excited, wanting to say something but not daring to speak. The knife was pressed tightly against her neck. Marco hid behind Maria, her small frame, no match for his larger body. He only kept his head hidden behind her. He peeked out at me, then pulled his head back, shouting, "George, your family is so rich. You can't give me $5 million. Are all you rich people so cold-blooded? Can't you help someone out?" My ex-mother-in-law dropped to her knees in front of me, begging son-in-law, "Please give him the money. He's still just a kid. He doesn't know what he's doing. He's been pushed to the edge. Please have mercy and save him. You're the only one who can save our family now." The middle-aged police officer helped her to her feet, trying to calm her down. I didn't say I'd help him or not. I just stood there coldly, watching their family drama unfold. I suspected this was another one of their schemes to get money, but this time the police had been involved. I silently wondered what would happen next. If I gave him the money, Marco would likely ask for an escape vehicle. But with the current police force and technology, he wouldn't be able to escape. If I didn't give him the money, would he really kill his sister? Marco, seeing I wasn't saying anything, began to break down, crying, "I've been forced into a corner. They already chopped off one of my fingers. They said if I don't pay them back, they'll cut off one of my legs. If I can't pay the money, I might as well die with her." When I still didn't respond, his anger flared and he shouted, "Do you think I want to use my sister as a hostage? George, I hate you the most. I was going to kill your parents and take your family's wealth, but..." He choked up. "You guys have such good security. I didn't even have a chance to get close to your parents.
Why?
Why are some people born with everything while others are born with nothing?" Maria's neck wound deepened, and she struggled in pain. Marco's face twisted with rage as he shouted, "If I'm going to die, I'll drag you down with me." He then threw the kitchen knife at me. The knife flew toward my face, but I managed to dodge just in time. A gunshot rang out. Marco, having thrown the knife, revealed himself just in time for a sniper's bullet to strike him. Maria collapsed to the ground. My ex-mother-in-law froze for a moment, then screamed and rushed inside, throwing herself on top of Marco, trying to pull him up, screaming my name. Marco's mouth foamed with blood, and the floor was soaked with it. The police and paramedics rushed in, pulling my ex-mother-in-law aside to treat Marco and Maria. In a frenzy, my ex-mother-in-law lunged at me, crying out, "All you had to do was agree to give him the money. Why didn't you agree? Why didn't you just give him the money? It's your fault my son is dead." The middle-aged officer tried to stop her, but he couldn't hold her back. I put my arms up to shield my head and kicked her away. She went wild, throwing herself at the police officers, grabbing and hitting them, shouting that they had killed her son. A few officers rushed in and restrained her.
Chapter 9.
After Marco went to prison, Maria and my ex-mother-in-law disappeared, and I didn't hear anything from them. One day, when Willow came over during her break to hang out with us, she suddenly confessed her feelings to me. I agreed. My parents and Willow's parents were both very enthusiastic about arranging our wedding. After Willow and her family left, my parents called me into the study and said they had something to tell me. My dad asked, "Have you seen your ex-girlfriend's mom recently?" I was a bit puzzled by the sudden question and shook my head, saying I hadn't seen her. My parents exchanged a look before my dad continued. "She's been hanging around our neighborhood lately. One time she even tried to fake an accident with our car." My mom gave me a strange looking at it, and she was dressed so lightly for the winter. She was only wearing a thin coat and a dress. We live in the north where it's well below freezing in winter, and everyone wears down jackets or fur coats. Who would stand outside in a dress? Could it be? I glanced at my dad and thought to myself, those two really have their eyes on our family. They won't stop until they get something out of us, I said, just to be safe. "Mom and Dad, you should move into the house in the southern city for a few days. It's been vacant for a while, and the formaldehyde has been aired out. Her son's in prison, and their family is completely insane. I'm worried she might do something to you guys." My parents agreed. As soon as I got home, I had my secretary keep an eye on my ex-mother-in-law's movements, just in case she really tried something. After all, she had nothing to lose. A few days later, my secretary came to report that after waiting at the entrance of our neighborhood for a few days, she hadn't seen our car and got bored, so she left. Recently, she stopped hanging around our neighborhood and started doing square dancing instead. With her bold dance moves and swaying skirt, she managed to hook an old rich man. While dancing, she sprained her ankle and fell right into the old man's arms, making him feel some romantic stirrings. She swindled 200,000 yuan from him, and soon his wife and children showed up at her door, beating her up in a fit of rage. My ex-mother-in-law gave up on any attempts to get money, but she was now desperate for her life. The old man's wife and daughter had no choice but to take her to court. As for what happened after that, I told my secretary not to worry about it anymore. That family would take care of her. Chapter 10. My marriage to Willow went smoothly. Relatives and friends all congratulated us, saying that good things come after many trials and that I had found true love. They praised Willow endlessly, calling her as beautiful as a flower, as graceful as a fallen goose, with beauty inside and out. I glanced at Willow, who insisted on wearing a police uniform for our wedding. 3 crows flew overhead. What did all these compliments have to do with Willow? She was almost too handsome, surpassing me in looks. All the female guests at the wedding were screaming and cheering, calling the bride so handsome, completely overshadowing my presence. One evening after the wedding, Willow was lying in my arms when she suddenly asked if I knew what Maria had been up to lately. I didn't take it seriously and casually replied, "No idea. Whatever she's doing, it's none of my business anymore." Willow sat up and said, "That's not what I meant. I overheard a colleague talking about a case today and realized it was related to her after her brother went to prison. The loan sharks didn't let Maria off the hook. Her mom disappeared without a trace, so they captured Maria. They lied to her, saying if she didn't pay back the money, they'd have her brother killed in prison. But they couldn't even get to Marco in prison. They were just tricking her. Sadly, Maria believed them. To save her brother, she told the loan sharks she had a way to make big money and needed more time. She asked them to send her 2 people to supervise her and help her out. Maria's plan was to lure several girls, imprison them, and force them to engage in prostitution while filming and uploading the videos online. She's facing charges for organizing prostitution and distributing obscene videos, which could land her a sentence of over 10 years. I was speechless after hearing Willow's words. Maria seemed like a complete stranger to me now, as though I had never known her. The years I spent with her felt like a dream, I said. She chose her own path. There's nothing we can do about it. Let's sleep. From that point on, that family disappeared completely from my life.